Good afternoon. The purpose of these online presentations is to allow you to spend time listening to and looking at the material that we are attempting to cover here. This is not a substitute for any readings or activities that you will find in the module. There will be a quiz or some other kind of activity to verify your understanding of the material and help you identify where you may have some deficiencies. Let's begin. This particular presentation is on understanding research design. Let's start at the beginning. When we talk about research design, we're primarily talking about what you need to do as you work to put together a research study or other kind of project that will be used to examine a clinical problem or some other kind of issue to come up with an answer either that allows you to generalize your material or to provide a resolution. So let's look at the basic two types of research that exist. The first is quantitative research. This particular method uses numbers, statistical methods, and provides an objective answer, a quantified answer, that can be used to make generalizations to larger populations and can also be used to test whether or not a hypothesis meets certain standards or can be rejected. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is more dealing with feelings, emotions, and other non-quantifiable or things that you cannot you cannot measure using either numbers or some other kind of variable that allows you to apply quantitative research statistical techniques to it for the purposes of coming up with your answer. Generally speaking, qualitative studies do not allow you to generalize the results to larger populations or groups outside of a well-defined population. Now let's subdivide these categories just a little bit more. First, basic research. Basic research is straightforward, descriptive, gives you some information, and may be used to increase knowledge or information in an area. Applied research gives us information that we can use to either increase understanding, affect change in an environment, and generally allows us to identify and propose solutions to issues or problems. Applied research is closely related to clinical research in that there's a problem, issue, diagnosis, or characteristic that needs to be dealt with or to which a revision or a cure would be helpful. Evaluation research, as we see, examines processes and outcomes associated with the solution to the problem. So in other words, we're looking at evaluation research for the purposes of making a decision. Now, the decision can either be formative, and what we mean by formative is that it is used to affect some kind of change in what you do. It is used to assess the effectiveness of the progress of a program. And the purpose of formative is that it should result in some kinds of changes, intervention, or something that improves or alters the way a treatment is delivered or education is delivered or something like that. Summative, on the other hand, is the kind of study and the kind of research that comes to make a decision evaluating effectiveness, solution, program, etc. It could be something as simple as grading. It could be something as simple as, do we do something, do we not do something? It's a decision that usually is somewhat final in its nature. Action research, which is primarily used, or used significantly, I should say, in the field of education, is used within the confines of a particular group, organization, or community, and the results are really not useful outside of that particular venue. And oftentimes the results of action research is to simply make changes to the program or to the organization in which the research is done. Clinical research, which really applies to what happens in the medical world, looks to advance medical knowledge. Now, medical knowledge can include such things as types of treatments, it can include effectiveness of treatments, it can look at disease patterns and whatever in a variety of patients or groups, and it is done either by interacting directly with the patient, or it can be done through analysis of blood, body tissues, or other kinds of samples that are collected from the patient. Additional information on the use of clinical research and what clinical trials entail can be found at the National Institutes of Health website on clinical trials and clinical research. Now, once you decide which one of those categories in which you wish to work, then you start to get yourself organized. Clinical and experimental research studies need to have thought out and well-designed research questions and either well-structured research hypotheses or well-structured parameters from which to develop the research question. Some of the things that we've talked about so far involve a methodology called PICO for the purposes of putting together a research question. Now, let's look at a couple of things. When you're doing a research study or doing some kind of study to evaluate the effectiveness of a clinical intervention, you want to make sure that everything that you do, from literature review to methodology to analysis to discussing the analysis, is based on the research question or hypothesis that is proposed from which you built your study. Varying from this point and varying from the basic research question complicates studies, reduces their validity, and oftentimes can create problems which will end up being unresolvable. You have to do some things to do this well. One of the first things is to review the literature. One of the modules in this course involves sending you to the literature to gain references for the purposes of studying what has already been done in the field related to your research question. You need to know what's been done by others and whether or not it's appropriate to reproduce what's been done by others, come up with your own methodology, or come up with some kind of mix or hybrid of the two. Then you need to come up with how you're going to do your study, which is what we're going to discuss here. What is the design of the study? What type of study is it going to be? You need to come up with variables, and we'll discuss variables a little later. But basically there are two types of variables. There are independent variables, which are ones that you manipulate, control, or set up. And then there are dependent variables, and these are the ones that you measure to make a decision, but you do not control or manipulate these variables. Then, once the results are gathered, you analyze the data appropriately, and you report that data discussing how it relates to the literature, how it relates to your research question, and what kinds of things are going to be learned from your study. On the quantitative side, we want to be able to answer some questions. First of all, can I describe the data? In other words, what does the sample that I have collected look like? Is it representative of the group that I measured? And what trends can I see from that? That can be done with graphs and tables, as well as numerical statistical calculations. The second question that I want to look at is there a relationship between those variables? So, for example, is the way somebody performs on one variable, or the scores on one variable, have a pattern that is similar to or related to the response pattern on another variable? For example, is the way someone did a pretest and scored on a pretest, and I look at my group and I say, now did my group score in a similar fashion on a post-test? Now, is there a significant difference in the means of groups on the dependent variable? In other words, did group A score significantly different on the variable I'm measuring Then group B, and can that decision be made within a reasonable amount of certainty? And that certainty will be discussed later when we talk about analysis of data. Can I predict how someone will perform on one variable from the other? And this requires the use of a more advanced statistical technique called regression, which takes into account all of the factors that are necessary for the purpose of making a statement about causation or prediction. And of course, the last question that comes up when you talk about analyzing variables is, what do I do if these variables are categorical? In other words, if their numerical values don't have inherent numerical values. Now, in addition, we have some questions that we want to answer when we have studies that are qualitative in nature. So, for example, what do I do to describe the nature of responses in my sample when variables that I measure or the information that I collect is not numerical? I also want to be able to look at how something is done. How did it occur? Maybe how do you feel about it, etc. What do you feel? What do you think? What are the results? These are, from a qualitative standpoint, these sorts of things can be measured using various techniques that are not numerical or quantitative in nature. Can you identify trends? Can you identify patterns? Can you identify feelings, emotions, reactions, etc.? Can you describe what happened? And what is the meaning of something? Because oftentimes meaning is a result of a subjective interpretation of what went on. Meanings can also be related to higher level psychological concepts that are called constructs, which are identifying characteristics or traits that are decided upon by looking at patterns in observable variables. More information about qualitative studies can be found in the Poses and Eisen article that is located on the Canvas website for you. Once you get through doing your homework, looking at what's going on, and deciding what you really want to get answered, and you fine-pointed your research question, then you can move into coming up with an appropriate design. You'll notice on this slide that we talk about a number of things, but the first couple things that take place involve the research question itself. In other words, how do I come up with a research question? And then, from that point, the second step involves looking at the literature to verify whether or not your question is appropriate, to come up with appropriate detail, and then potentially to revise that question as necessary based on what you learn. One of the things that you notice here that is a little bit interesting is that the question arises, is this a novel question? So in other words, if it's been done 100 times before, and it's not new, it's not novel, it's not something that's going to give additional information, it's probably not worth your time. As we look forward into the process and the process progresses, we will see that as you develop objectives, as you look at feasibility and sample size, you get to make more decisions. As we move ahead, we begin to see that there is a logical progression of steps in the research design. But at any point in time, as you look at what's going on and evaluate the process, everything is done in an orderly fashion, working from those steps that have to take place before your study takes place to those steps that involve analysis, discussion, development of conclusions, and sending your material for dissemination or publication. So, let's look at the quantitative designs. The thing you'll notice about this little, shall we say, comic on the left here is that the point we're trying to make is that you can't come up with conclusions before you've collected data. It just doesn't make any sense. So descriptive research looks at stuff and decides, describes. That's what it does. Usually no decisions are made about any of the other research questions other than what does the response pattern of my sample look like. Most studies that do this are observational in nature because you just want to get a handle on what's going on, oftentimes done in preparation for a higher level or more detailed design study, which will work to make decisions and descriptions based on higher level analysis of the data. Correlational designs, on the other hand, look at relationships in response pattern between two variables. I mentioned this a couple of moments ago. One of the things to be very careful about is that just because there is a strong correlation between response patterns of two variables, it does not mean that one thing causes another, or that one variable causes the other to take place. You can have things that are related in their response pattern within your sample, but the two things are not conceptually related, but they don't make any sense to put them together. The slang term we always use is comparing apples to oranges. In quasi-experimental data, we start to look for things like cause and effect relationships. We're trying to look at things where we may not manipulate the independent variables. We simply have the independent variables in place as categorical or categorizing factors, but we look and observe what's going on with our selected dependent variable. Also, we may have one group who gets exposed to something and another group that doesn't. The control group is the group that we use to make the basis for our comparison or for our cause-effect relationship. One of the big differentiators between quasi-experimental design and experimental design, which we will present next, is that the way that the samples are put together don't always match. You may not always have a randomly selected sample in a quasi-experimental design. Experimental designs and a true experimental design can be used to at differences between group variables, may look at cause-effect, may look at correlational relationships, but the key here is that the independent variables are manipulated so that we can then collect data on the dependent variable and analyze that to determine the answer to the question that we're asking. The standards for true experimental designs are higher in that the way subjects are selected and the statistical tools that can be used in these quantitative models have much tighter rules. So to sum up what we're looking at between experimental and true experimental, as you look down the left side in the true experiment, we see high internal validity, meaning that within the structure of the study, we are seeing that everything falls in line and that procedures have been taken place so that we are measuring what we say that we are measuring and we are meeting the high standards. In a quasi-experimental, we focus on external validity. In other words, is what we're looking at describing what we see happening in a real or natural environment? The difference between the real environment and the artificial environment is that in the real environment there are obviously many more factors that can take place that can negatively affect or alter our outcome. We see the differences in subject assignment, and we see that in a true experiment we control our procedures and manipulate our variables, which may not take place in a quasi-experimental design. So in a nutshell, we have a variety of things that take place here, different names applying to different methodologies that are very similar. So in a pre-experimental situation, we're going to see maybe a one-shot case study. We're going to see two groups, or we'll see a group in which there's no changes. In a true experimental design, we will have control groups and various groups that are randomly assigned. We may see a post-test only group compared to a control group, okay, or we may see a specific four-group model. In quasi-experimental data, we use sometimes something called time series, where we may be looking at the same subjects, but we're looking at them over a period of time. Or we will see multiple time series and compare how the progress of subjects occurs in one group over a given amount of time versus how another group compares. And then in the last category, they talk about statistical research designs, and these are set together for the purposes of controlling certain variables that may appear during the research process. So things like randomized blocks and Latin squares and factorial designs primarily involve things you need to do to the statistics to control for certain differences in the study. Fortunately or unfortunately, not everything can be reserved with a numerical model. Now, most of you that have been following understand that I'm primarily a quantitative guy, which means that I like numbers and, you know, things in line. Dr. Garden, being the more qualitative researcher, is much more comfortable with the methodologies involved in putting together a qualitative research study. So I teasingly call this the dark side, but by no means think that qualitative research does not have a position and does not have value. Focus groups, survey research, and other things are extremely important in a number of disciplines. Okay, why do we do it? We want to get a deep understanding of a topic, organization, something, phenomenon, whatever. We want to look at firsthand experience, truthful reporting. In other words, we want to look at subject input as to how they understand things and how meaningful are the influences from what goes on around them. And then we use observations as the data collection method. And that's important to understand. Lots of times we're not looking to answer, does this cause this? Or, you know, is there a significant difference between two groups in this data? Because those questions tend to be quantitative in nature. Here we're looking at things like why, how, why is this important? How does it affect you, etc., etc. Now, patient perception information is a really good tool to show how qualitative research can be helpful to structuring a good evidence-based practice model in your field. Okay? Now, if we can observe something directly, we don't have to interpret what people tell us, so that reduces subject error or reduces what we sometimes call distortion. For example, a questionnaire is a direct observation method. Surveys, etc., are a direct observation method. We don't have to interpret things. Okay, the other advantage to written methodology is that people who maybe can't speak or who are language dependent can express themselves without being bound by language. Qualitative research methodology generates data in social settings in context of the society or sociological condition in which they are currently involved, and is oftentimes used to help set up the emotional and the warm and fuzzy or patient perception based avenues for patient care. We look for meanings, we look for flexibility. These are the kinds of things that are used to see what are people thinking and how do they work. It doesn't stick treatments, manipulate variables, or do the same things we do with the quantitative studies, because we're not attempting to answer the same sorts of questions. One of the downsides is that with a lot of what's done in qualitative world, we cannot generalize to large populations of people because the groups from whom we're collecting data are relatively well-defined and isolated. Attempting to do so would generate error that would make most of what you collect fairly useless. So here again, we look at a summary table which very nicely describes for you some of the strengths or advantages and some of the limitations or drawbacks related to qualitative analysis. So you're going to choose a study. So you now want to look at, how do I decide? So the left-hand column over here is looking at quantitative designs. Here are the ones we just kind of talked about and what they're used for. The qualitative general design methods that are listed over here talk about what we're attempting to focus on, what kinds of information are we going to get, so that we can look at the nature of the interpretation. When you build a study, you want to be aware of the fact that if you're going to do surveys or questionnaires about perception and image and feelings, etc., that you're going to be in the qualitative road. And so you want to kind of look at the different models here to see which best fits what you're trying to learn. Another slide, same kind of action, talks about the 5 categories that we see and what we're generally doing and how they're related to methodology. So we have phenomenology, which looks to study how someone's experience of an event, a culture, an activity, something called a phenomenon. It comes out of philosophy, and you can see below what we do to get the info and how we report it. The same kinds of information is reported across. Ethnography looks at assessing characteristics of a group of people or characteristics of a particular population or sample of people or society. Narrative inquiry looks at people's stories and their understanding of things that are taking place. A case study looks at an in-depth analysis of an individual study or an individual subject, I should say, or a small group. And grounded theory generally works to study phenomenon inductively instead of deductively, and as a result, sociologists use this methodology commonly. Here are your methodologies in a nutshell to help remind you that they're present. Let's look at quantitative versus qualitative research. So what is the general purpose? We want to find new ideas. We want to test theory and hypothesis. We want to do exploratory research and data collection. In the quantitative world, we look at specific questions and we want to come up with specific answers. So qualitatively, we're concerned with getting in depth as to what's going on. Quantitative, from a common purpose, we're testing something to see if it is probably true or not. What do? In qualitative, we observe and interpret. We can talk to people, we can watch people, we can get studies, but we look at what's happening, we collect information, and we make interpretations. In the quantitative world, we set up variables, we measure the variables, we test hypotheses and come to our conclusions. Look at the relative structure between the two. Obviously, quantitative has to be much more structured and standard because anything you do to change the variable adds error to the study. The researchers are very involved because they have to interact in qualitative research. In quantitative research, they are not as involved because the participant interacts with the variable or with the intervention and not directly with the researcher in the vast majority of cases. The samples, relatively large and quantitative, especially to keep the power of the study up, and It's most often used for descriptive, explanatory research and to attempt to support or disprove hypotheses. Qualitative research examines, explores, and describes. Same kind of concept, little different presentation with certain types of common study designs and examples, and this is for the quantitative side. Quantitative side. So let's sum all this up. Let's give you a little bit of a practice quiz to go with this. Okay. Which is better for important research projects? A, quantitative research designs. B, qualitative research designs. C, neither. D, depends. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think this through. Well, hopefully you're done thinking. Let's look at the answer. Okay. We're definitely going to say that that's probably not better. Well, that's probably no good. Quantitative doesn't necessarily better, because remember, what is the better method depends on the questions to be asked, the type of information to be gained, or what you're attempting to do with the results of the study, whether you're going to apply it to a smaller group, to a larger group, whether you're attempting to generalize to the population. So the answer of which is better for important research is, it depends on what I'm doing. Additional information to help you understand generally what's going on with research design can be found at the University of Wisconsin Ebeling Library Nursing Resources site. The website is here. The link should be active. Thanks for listening, and I hope this helped you understand it. You will find the quiz on Canvas.